From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Car Night Show. Inviting join Nolan as guest this week, Paul Von Mertens to the show. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the show. Joining me this week, as Gary Griffin says, he's the man with all the toys from Chicago, Illinois. He's been playing with Brian Wilson, helping him put together all those beautiful songs and shows over the last nearly quarter of a century with his great solo band. And when he's not working with Brian, you may find him working on his own material or working in orchestra pits with great artists as well. He's the one and only Mr. Paul Von Mertens. Paul, how are you today?
Good, Nolan. Nice to see you.
Of course. Likewise, I have to say that as well. And I said off camera that I was able to see, or I was fortunate enough to see you guys this past summer, which was a great concert to see you play with Chicago. And I'm sure, being that you are a saxophone player, to play with the horn section and the other guys, the founding members of Chicago, who also play some of those instruments, I'm sure was a big treat for you.
Yeah, definitely. On part of the tour, they came out and joined the band on Darlin, the horn section. And it really meant a lot to me because when I was in high school and I should have been practicing my clarinet lesson, I was trying to jam along with Chicago records.
Sure.
So it was a real pleasure.
Sure. Well, besides that, it was great to see you and the rest of the group, and I'm sure others who are fans of other types of music were great to be able to see musicians and other type of acts such as that over especially the last 3 years of the craziness that we've had. And, you know, you're part of the music industry, so you've experienced all this wilding and craziness as a working musician. What's it like now at this point to finally be able to do something like that, to go out and tour and there's no real seriousness and sense of it, what it was at the beginning?
Well, it's definitely a pleasure to get back out and to be playing for live audiences. You know, to see all my friends, to be playing great music again. I know we all really missed it a lot. And I guess I feel like I appreciate it that much more,
sure,
having not been able to tour, not being able to play live for a period of time. It's really been just sweet to come back to it.
Well, like you just said, I've kind of gotten this from those who have had on there, not just the music world, but with the last few years that we've all gone through this all together, you start to appreciate the little things more than others. Being able to go on stage during a rehearsal and warm up your instrument and warm up your vocal cords, whereas we weren't able to do it, or you weren't able to do it during the pandemic. I'm curious, and this follow-up question that kind of goes with it. What's Paul Von Mertens learned about himself during this time that he hasn't known about himself prior to it?
Wow. Well, you know, a silver lining for me was that I got to spend a lot more time with my daughter, who's 12 years old now. And I'm often on the road, touring a lot, and having all that time at home gave me an opportunity to focus on my family, on my daughter. So that was, as I said, that was a silver lining for me. And also really just how much I need contact with other people to be creative, to be happy and productive. So, yeah.
I sort of want to go as early as I can, or earliest as you want to go back. And remember, you're, as I said in the intro, from Chicago, Illinois, as you grew up in that area, which is a hotbed for music, not just LA or Detroit or places of that nature. And you said you did an appearance on Beach Boys Talk a while back, how you were sort of talked about how you're a casual fan and an aspect with the Beach Boys. Maybe you were a Chicago fan, seeing as they were from Chicago, since they were the Chicago Transit Authority at the beginning. What was your relationship with music in the sense of not just as a fan, but in the sense of possibly doing it later on for money as a career?
Well, I got serious about playing when I was in high school. About, I would say, halfway through high school was when I switched from clarinet, which I was honestly not all that excited about, to saxophone, which was much more exciting, much more interesting. So I started practicing. I started playing more. I started a band with my friends, and we were listening to a lot of jazz records and trying to figure out that music and how to play it. So that was my early experience in high school, was finding a creative outlet, finding something that I really enjoyed doing. And when I graduated from high school, I felt like I just wanted to keep going and learn as much about music as I could. And I think pretty much right from the beginning, I wanted to be a musician. And I didn't have a burning desire to do something else.
Sure.
So it was, once I started working on it and improving and getting good at it and playing with other people, I just felt like there was nothing else that I would rather do.
Sure. Well, that's good to know that, that's the only vision you see yourself down the line doing. That means that you really enjoy doing it. I'm curious on this, although you went to college, you went to DePaul, and got a degree there. Do you think, though, not being only a casual fan of Brian's music and in that aspect, and maybe going to school gave you a greater appreciation when you first got into Brian's band early on?
Definitely. I mean, there were a lot of revelatory experiences when I heard music that I had not heard before, that I wasn't familiar with. So that was a very exciting time. And in the early years working with the band, I had the opportunity to learn so much about the music, and especially about Brian's music, but also pop music in general, from Darian Sahanaja and Proben and Nick Walusko, from Mike D'Amico, because they're all really scholars of pop music. They have a deep knowledge.
Sure.
And I had a kind of a different sort of training. I mean, I liked pop music, but I was also had studied and played jazz a lot. I got a degree in classical saxophone from DePaul, so I had pretty broad interests in music. But this definitely filled a niche that I enjoyed learning more about.
I'm curious about the DePaul situation, if you're willing to share. We know that Berkeley is the big place for school, music school. What was it about DePaul for you in terms of going to school for music that spoke out to you?
Well, my initial reason for going to DePaul was that I was studying with Robert Black. After I graduated from high school, I spent a year working a construction job and practicing at night. And I was studying with Robert Black at the time, who is an outstanding classical saxophonist. And at the end of that year, he said, look, you should go to college. You should go to school full time and study music. I'm going to be teaching at DePaul next year. Why don't you come to DePaul, study with me, and really get serious about this? So that's what I did. I mean, that was the reason that I went. It turned out to be a very good place for me because one thing about the music school at that time, and I think this has always been true of DePaul and still is, the faculty are pretty much all working professionals in the Chicago music scene. And they helped me get my first professional opportunities because they were involved in the professional music community. And there was a kind of down-to-earth work ethic in general at DePaul. I felt like many of my peers, and I know that I was there to work in music, to somehow to make a living, whether it be teaching, playing, writing, arranging. There was a kind of professional ethos
Right.
about the whole thing. High artistic standards as well, but there was sort of a practical underpinning to it as
Sure.
also.
When Brian was living out in St. Charles, he's starting to work on his Imagination album, which has some beautiful music on there. I think my favorite song on that album is the song Cry that he sings on there. It's such a beautiful sort of bluesy almost type of song. When you were working on that, and although they were just sessions, so you probably thought, who knows what's going to happen with this and where this is going to end up and on what album. Did you, after those sessions, so did you ever have any idea or notion that, oh, hey, maybe I'll be working with him after this? Or was it just another day in the office where you're working just with someone that day?
Um, well, I mean, it started with one phone call, and but that first session seemed pretty momentous because I'd worked with a lot of artists by that time, but you know, Brian was an iconic artist,
Sure.
and also I was pretty certain that this was going to be a good album. It was going to see the light of day and would get some attention. So it wasn't really, it wasn't another day at the office. It was pretty special from the beginning.
Sure.
To meet Brian, and to be participating. And it was Jim Peterick who referred me to Brian, because he had worked some with Brian, and I had worked with Jim in the past, and they were looking for a horn player. And Jim said, "You should call this guy." So that's how I ended up there. And I'm still here.
That's not too shabby to have someone like Jim Peterick to give you the okay to say that you're a pretty good musician to want to do some sessions with Brian Wilson. I have to say.
Yeah.
You, like you just said, you're still here. You're still at Brian, which is great in and of itself. What was it like for you to get that call to be asked to be part of that first small tour that Brian did for that album that would begin his solo career?
I was glad to do it. I had enjoyed working on the record, and the possibility of touring and playing live was definitely very interesting and exciting. It seemed like a good opportunity to me, and it seemed to be. It was going in the direction that I had always wanted to go, which is towards more and more creative music, and working with talented people, working with good artists. I was a little bit unsure how Brian would feel about going on the road, or whether he would enjoy it or not. Because up till then, my experiences had been with him in the studio and one live gig that we did in St. Charles. And he was nervous, about performing live. So, I think there were some butterflies, certainly for Brian and for the rest of us too, because there was quite a buzz about the tour, and fans who knew about it were very excited. So there was a certain amount of pressure to deliver a good live show. And at that point, I hadn't met Darian or the other LA guys. But once we started rehearsing together, I knew that it was going to be very exciting. So.
Yeah. You mentioned the butterflies, but then also you mentioned of the scholarly guys who know Brian's music, know that type of music, that know everything you can about being Darian and Nicky Wonder and then Proben and Mike D'Amico. How much at ease did it make you feel to have those musicians there at the beginning to help you learn that music and sort of understand all of it?
Oh, well, it was really helpful. And I was very willing to learn. They were, everybody was really generous in sharing their knowledge, their appreciation for the music. and it's still that way
Yeah.
in the band. You know, at this point we have a strong bond, having
Sure.
had all these musical experiences together. There's a lot of love and respect in the band for Brian and for each
Yes.
other. And it felt, you know, it felt really good right away because everyone was excited to
Sure.
be there and excited about the opportunity. And but yeah, everybody was really generous with me in terms of uh, helping to learn the music, pointing
Sure.
out, you know, interesting or important aspects of the arrangements, and working those arrangements out in a way that we could perform the songs live was something everyone just rolled up their sleeves and started working on it. So
After that tour in the late 90s, it sort of, I think, gives Brian the notion, and maybe Melinda and his management team, that, hey, you know, we have something here. Brian now has experience going back out on stage, and now he can go back touring and sort of have this second act again. For you to see that, and maybe you mentioned this with the early tour, but prior to that, that now that you're part of the group and now you're Brian's sort of backing group and supporting cast, what was that like to now help Brian realize that he can now go back out and now he's still loved and still appreciated, if not more than ever?
um, well, the we toured Pet Sounds early on,
Yeah.
and that felt like uh, kind of a major hurdle in a way, to revisit that music. And the first time we rehearsed You Still Believe in Me, we ran through it and it sounded pretty good. And Brian said, I haven't sung that since I recorded it.
Wow.
So, and this was 40 years later. So that was a really remarkable experience. And then to revisit Smile, Brian Van Dyke and Darian, you know, put together really what is now the definitive version of that record that had been the subject of so much speculation, and was, I think, Brian suffered a real rejection when that project was abandoned. So to finish it, to play it live in London at Festival Hall, and to see Brian just kind of taking in all the applause at the end of the performance, it was, you know, an amazing opportunity to see someone kind of get a piece of their life back that nobody ever thought
Sure.
that
Yeah.
it would happen. They thought it was done. You know, it was passed over. And so to see someone, you know, retrieve something in their life that was kind of disparaged by some people and not really appreciated was an amazing experience and something I'll never forget.
Well, and I wanted to make sure I asked you about that because and David Leaf's beautiful documentary about it, Beautiful Dreamer, it describes that process of Brian revisiting it and Darian helping him. And I had David Leaf on a few weeks ago, and he sort of talked about his relationship with Brian, how he sort of helped Brian get back into the mental stage of wanting to get around to Smile and wanting to complete it. For you to have witnessed that and seeing that and then helping perform it, what was that like? Because you've talked about how you always want to be doing something creative. Was that a high point creatively for you on stage?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I can say that I've never worked so hard with a group of musicians as we did on the rehearsals preparing for those performances. You know, we felt like that it was momentous, and
Sure.
it had to be great. It had to be as good as we could make it. And we felt, well, speaking for myself, I felt very well prepared
Sure.
for it. And at the same time, talk about butterflies. We just didn't know what people would think. We liked it,
Sure.
and we thought that it was really cool, but we didn't really know what kind of reaction we would get. So the fact that there was such resounding praise for it and was incredibly satisfying, rewarding. Yeah, I would call it a high point for me.
There's a moment, and it sort of connects to the question I want to ask you, where in Long Promised Road, you see where you're working on Honeycomb and Brian sort of is helping you get played exactly how he is imagining the song. And being that you've written your own arrangements outside of Brian Wilson's group, and Brian's the epicenter, and he's the gold standard of producing and arranging and putting material out in the studio. What's it like, even still to this day, to experience the Brian Wilson as the producer and arranger in the studio?
Well, whenever Brian has something to say, I'm all ears. And I in the band, there are a lot of talented people, with a lot of ideas, a lot of great ideas. Everybody is a really good musician. And I think part of the dynamic in the studio, and somewhat when we tour also, is to kind of hold back a little bit,
Sure.
Stay out of the way and give Brian the space to work. Because if there are too many voices and too much clamoring for attention, he won't necessarily come forward.
Sure.
So I think part of the experience of being with Brian in the studio is to make sure that things are calm, are comfortable, that Brian has the space to be creative and to bring his ideas out.
As a musician, and although you've been with him in the studio practically since the beginning with Imagination, is that besides Smile and maybe Imagination, since that was at the beginning, is there an album you worked on with Brian that you're really proud of besides Smile and Imagination?
Yeah, the Gershwin record.
Yeah.
Yeah. I worked pretty closely with Brian on that in the song selection and preparing the arrangements for the recording sessions. And I'm really happy with the way that it came out. I mean, I think it delivers what it promises, which is Brian's reimagining of Gershwin's music. I think it shows Brian's love and respect for the music, and it also has his indelible stamp on it as well. So that record I'm particularly proud of, and in terms of contributing arrangements for strings and horns and that kind of thing, I worked closely with Brian on all of that stuff, and so it was a great opportunity for me as a writer and arranger to have that opportunity. Yeah.
Well, when I had David Leaf on, and I wanted to try to listen to as much as Brian's solo material as I could, to having at least the ability to say, oh yeah, hey, this stuff at this period of time was really good, instead of looking like a fool and not knowing what I was talking about. And during that time, I listened to the Gershwin album and was able to listen to the material on there. And it's another example of Brian where, he has clearly and obviously the surfing stuff, the Cars, all that good jazz, but then he's got material like this, which is still so good. And there's a handful of lists. I'm not going to go on my phone and list all the songs from the album that I like, but there's so much material on there. And to me, it's sort of where I think he may truly want to be. You see with Pet Sounds, it's a heavy influence of, classical type of stuff and arrangements compared to the earlier stuff where it's more gritty, hard rock and roll. And I'm sure for you to have gone to DePaul, get a degree in classical saxophone and sort of experience that was a big victory for your own self and accomplishment for you. In 2012, you joined Brian and the rest of his group and the Beach Boys for their 50th anniversary. For you to have experienced that, I'm sure that was a big treat for you to tour with them for that long and to see all those fans across the world, thousands, tens of thousands of fans. Sort of describe for you that beginning of that tour in the sense of realizing it was going to happen and actually those first few dates.
The 50th anniversary tour, when it was proposed, there was a lot of excitement about it. There was also a lot to work out in terms of just practically how will this happen? How will it be done? And Brian agreed to do it, and he said, "I want to bring my band."
Yeah.
So we had to, figure out a way to merge the Beach Boys touring band and Brian's band, and I think we did that pretty successfully, and ended up with a lot of people on stage. But I think everybody played their roles well. The shows themselves were, I would say, were ranged from great to epic. And so that was exciting. And also just to be on the road for 6 months, to be away from my family for that entire time. My daughter was very small, was also challenging because it was a lot of work. It was a little bit hard to be away from home at times. But the 2.5 hours that we were on stage for the show were just amazing. Yeah. I can remember a few moments on the tour where I felt like something, kind of one of a kind, really special was happening. And one was playing Red Rocks with that group.
During that tour, was there a song that you were looking forward to playing that, or songs that you were looking forward to playing that you weren't playing with Brian?
Well, not that I can remember. We did do a number of songs that we hadn't ever done with Brian. One song that I was not familiar with, that I thought was a nice addition to the set, was All This Is That.
Yeah.
That was, I didn't know that song very well, and I enjoyed doing that one. And I looked forward to doing Do You Want to Dance?
Yeah.
I think we had played it with Brian before, but on that tour, it was a little more amped up. John Cowsill's drumming was a little more like punk rock, garage band drive to it. So that was also kind of a standout.
Sure. During this times and since that period, I mean, the list is endless. He's worked with, most recently Chicago being Brian, Chicago, Jeff Beck. He did the tour with the Zombies, and he's back with Alan and Blondie. He's worked with a lot of big time artists during his solo career. And I've asked you a lot of times of experiences and seeing what it's like to be part of that. From your perspective, being on stage with him during those moments, what's that like for you to have been part of these big moments with Brian as a solo artist working with others?
Well, just thrilling. I mean, I think one of our first major kind of co-bill type tours was with Paul Simon.
Okay.
And I love Paul Simon's music, and I think that he's a really important artist when it comes to American music, and so that was exciting. It was also a little intimidating before the tour began, because Paul Simon sets a very high bar for songwriting, and
Sure.
he was doing songs from Graceland and Rhythm of the Saints, and um, his hits as well. And um, uh, I knew of most of the musicians in his band. I hadn't met them before, but I think I felt a little bit daunted at first. Like, are we going to measure up,
Sure.
or something like that? And uh, once we began the tour, I realized, and I heard from some of the guys in Paul Simon's band say, gosh, I wish I played with you guys. I wish I played with your band. So there was, this mutual respect that was very gratifying. And it also kind of made me realize, again, where Brian fits into the context of pop music in general, how broadly and greatly he's respected and admired.
Well, you saw with it, or especially you of all people, you were there for the All-Star tribute, but Paul Simon's there performing "Surfer Girl" at Brian's All-Star tribute, and that performance in itself, being able to, although I wasn't there seeing in person, but to see it on YouTube was out of this world in itself. And as you said, there's so many people who have been influenced by Brian and who say it, not just people in his band like yourself, but those who are stars from his same category, same period, who love him. Elton John, endlessly, even in the birthday message video, still endlessly loves him, supports him. Barry Gibb, another one who a big time supporter, Paul McCartney. And again, it's just another example where it's hard to fathom sometimes to see how much of an influence he still has or has on those who are out there, because some don't realize it. Those who are the big time fans realize it, but most don't. I had a guy on a while ago. His name is Chris Farmer, who toured with the Beach Boys in the late 90s and succeeded Carl as the musical director of the group, and you're the MD of Brian Wilson's group. For you, taking on that role, what was going through your mind at first when that first was going on? Because that's, I would think a big task to help put together the concert and make sure the songs fit together in the sense of a time constraint, but also making sure it flows together organically.
Yeah. Well, I do want to say one other thing about Paul Simon, because you mentioned his performance of Surfer Girl. We spent several days in New York rehearsing for that show, and each artist would come and rehearse with the band and do one or two of Brian's songs. And Billy Joel showed up and he wanted to sit down at the B3 and play "Don't Worry Baby," and Vince Gill did such an amazing job on "Surf's Up" and "Warmth of the Sun," and so just one after another, we were backing up these people, playing these amazing songs with great artists who loved Brian's music. And Paul Simon arrived with his acoustic guitar, and with each artist, Phil Ramone, who was the producer of that event, would say, okay, gather around and we'll talk about the song, with Billy or with Elton or whatever, and then we'll rehearse it and see how we're going to do it. So we stand in a circle around Paul Simon, and he has his guitar, and he said, I was working with my guitar teacher on an arrangement of Surfer Girl, and I'd like to play it for you. So the first thing I thought was, Paul Simon has a guitar teacher. At this point in his life, he's still working on his skills,
Yeah.
I thought that was so cool. And then he played that arrangement that you heard at the show, and there was complete silence from everybody in the band. And I think someone said, I don't think there's anything we can do to improve that. So that's the way that it ended up on the show. And of course it was just perfect.
Sure.
The way he did it. And I'm sorry, I lost the thread of your last question.
No, what I asked was, why I can't remember the dates specifically. I've done so many of these, but there's a guy who had on who and played with the Beach Boys in the late 90s into the early 2000s,
Oh,
named
right. Chris
Chris
Farmer.
Farmer, a beautiful musician in itself. And he succeeded Carl as the music director up until he left in 2007. For you, you are the musical director for Brian's group, and you help put together these beautiful, make sure the songs flow together, both as a time constraint, but also making sure organically it works together, and choosing the songs and putting them together. For you, when you first became the musical director for the group, how did you wrap your head around that, and what were you most looking forward to do with the position as musical director?
Well, I started in that role. I mean, I had already been in the band for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years before I took on that role. And I think from the very beginning, my desire was to, give Brian the space that he needed to work, give the band the information that they needed to do what they need to do. And I've never felt like I need to tell people what to play.
Sure.
And because everybody's a great musician. I am standing a little bit outside of the band, and listening to how everything's going on. So, I might make a suggestion about a part that is working or not working or something like that. But for me, it's mostly about keeping the train on the track, making sure everybody has the information that they need to do their best. So in a way, I feel like it's a logistical
Sure
role, and there's some wrangling involved, to get everybody in the room and to get everyone to work on the same song at the same time, and keep the train on the track. But I don't. I feel like I'm a facilitator. That's how I see my role.
When you began with the role, was there a song you were looking forward to, or maybe songs you're looking forward for to add to the set list? Because when Field Flows came out, there's a few new additions to the set list. I was like, oh, that's great to hear. I didn't think Brian would be able to sing that, but then here we are. We're seeing some of these songs. Did you have any situations like that early on?
I can't think of one in particular, like, oh, this is a song I've always wanted to do, and here's my chance.
Sure.
Because really, we've always been doing, mostly, I think, the band and Brian have been challenged to do things that are new and interesting. So I think everybody in the band thinks about that, like, is there a great song that we haven't done, that we could add
Sure.
To the set? And then for certain tours, there was a specific assignment. When we did Something Great from '68 with the Zombies, we had to do a very specific set list,
Sure.
songs from that record. Same with the Christmas album. We had to learn an entire album of songs that we had never played before, with the exception of The Man with All the Toys and Little Saint Nick. Those are songs that we had played at some point.
Yeah.
But the rest was really a matter of learning an entire album.
Sure.
Of really complex vocal arrangements. And I hope we get to do it again sometime, because that was really, I think, that was a beautiful show, the Christmas show that we did. What was that, 2017, 2018, a few years ago? But
one of the things that I want to ask you about, and I laugh at, my father was laughing like I can't explain, like a hyena about, is when Blondie comes on stage and he plays, I think it's Field Flows or some song, and he has that big guitar riff in the middle of the song, which I like, because then he walks around Brian, and Brian just looks at him while he's doing that, and he just goes crazy, and then there's Al joining in, and it just goes wild. As somebody in your position standing there, but also as the MD, how do you go through that in a calm sense of hopefully thinking that it hits the right time, so and you're able to get to the next song at the right time as well?
Um, well, Blondie he's he's a great spirit and a great
Yeah,
artist, and I think he brings something uh, really important to the show, which is uh, an an element of wildness, of some unpredictability,
sure.
which I think is a nice uh, balance, because a lot of what we do is it's very carefully planned out, and we do
Sure.
it with passion. Um, but when Blondie is on stage, everybody's keeping an eye on him to see what's going to happen, and he walks that tightrope incredibly well. I think that he's able to, you know, to show that like the wild side of his energy, but he's also very aware of where he is, where it's going, what he's doing, and I appreciate him so much. He's really a wonderful uh, part of the band. I look forward to it every night.
Sure, it's an amazing thing. I like how he starts Wild Honey and he just starts screeching and screeching, and then he goes into it, and the band goes crazy as well. We've talked about the creative endeavors, the high points that you've had with working with Brian, and I'm sure you've had other ones as well outside the group. But before you close up shop, which I'm sure you're not going to do anytime soon, is there a big goal that you have for yourself from an individual basis outside of working with Brian that you hope to achieve before the dust settles?
Uh, that I'd like to do personally.
Yeah,
Um, I would like to do. Um, I'm more and more interested in writing and arranging and working in the studio, and I'm less interested in touring, although I love playing live and I can't imagine ever not doing it. I also love collaborating with musicians on recording and arranging. And the Gershwin record was an example for me of the kind of thing that I would like to do all the time.
sure.
I've been able to do that with a band that I have been associated with here in Chicago called Poi Dog Pondering.
Okay.
And very eclectic band, really talented, interesting music. And I have an opportunity to really contribute a lot to the recordings and the
Sure.
performances. In fact, we're playing in New York on Saturday at Le Poisson Rouge. So more of that. I worked recently on a record by the Aluminum Group and contributed a lot of string and horn arrangements, and actually recorded it all here with Max Crawford from Poi Dog, and recorded strings and horn section and everything for that record. And it's out now. It's
Okay.
The band took a very long hiatus, about 10 years, but this new record is called The Aluminum Group, and
Okay.
it's quite amazing pop music, and it blends those orchestral elements with really interesting pop songs. So
Sure.
that's what I want to keep doing, just more of that.
Sure. Now, what I kind of chuckled at, but in the sense of it also was interesting because I wouldn't have expected it in one sense. When you were on with Matt and Greg Coffey, you talked about your fascination and love and your whatever the other term would be for fountain pens and how you have an affinity for fountain pens.
Yeah.
Where did that start and what fascinates you so much about fountain pens?
I think it started when I was a very young child, and my grandfather had an old like a roll top desk.
Okay. Yeah.
In the desk drawer, he had a bunch of stuff. But what was particularly interesting to me were his pocket knives, because he had quite a few of them, and also the pens and other writing instruments. So I think that's what sort of captured my imagination when I was when I was a kid, and uh, I still like pocket knives a lot. I have
Sure.
more than any reasonable person uh, needs. And I like fountain pens because they're like pocket knives. They're practical. They're kind of beautiful little machines. Um, there's an incredible variety of, in terms of material, in terms of the style and design. There's so many variations.
Sure.
So I guess that's what's interesting to me. And I like writing. I do a lot of journaling, and
Okay.
so I like the feeling of putting ink on paper.
Sure. Nothing like a good pen. Uh, this is before we end here, I want to end on a little game called the one word challenge. So in this game, what I'll do is throw out a few names of people or places or things that have some connection to my guest this week, being the amazing, the wonderful, talented Paul Von Mertens. He has to do his best to say either a word or two or sentence that best comes to mind when he hears the thing. Paul, you ready?
Okay, I'll try.
First one, Chicago.
My city.
London.
History.
Darren Sahanaja.
Brilliant.
Brian Wilson.
Really brilliant.
Success.
Overrated.
Music.
Life.
And last but certainly never least, in this cosmic universe we all live in, Paul Von Mertens.
Blessed.
Well, I have to share that. I have to double tap that one as well. I'm very blessed. And I want to say, sir, thank you for taking the time to do this and being kind enough to speak and share your insights and your story of your experience with Brian. It's been a great treat for me.
My pleasure, Nolan. Thank you.
Well, for all those out there who enjoy this, because who the heck wouldn't, down the line when Paul works on his next solo masterpiece and he wins a Grammy for it, you're going to say, oh my gosh, you should subscribe then. So subscribe, follow, like, comment, share, because you're going to want to do that. Follow on Twitter, Nolan Car Night, and Instagram, Nolan Car Night Show. Paul, I usually give this time to the guest, and you sort of mentioned it, the album you just worked on, but is there anything you'd want to put out or share to the world that you're working on or you just worked on?
Well, Poi Dog Pondering is working on another record, a new record, and it'll be out in the fall, late fall, early winter. So that's one thing that's on my plate right now that I'm looking forward to.
Well, I'll be looking forward to listening. I'm sure it'll be great, just as everything else you've worked on. In the words of Johnny Carson Ladine of the stuff this thing that talk shows, I bid you all a good night. Till next time, take care.